Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tonight's event is Dancing a Holistic Life, and this is a discussion with Susan Koff, inspired by her book, Dance Education, A Redefinition. My name is Molly Rogers, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for the Humanities at NYU. And the center provides a forum for cross-disciplinary discussion and collaboration in the arts and humanities. And we do this in two ways. We do this through a range of programs like working groups and fellowships. And we also provide a forum for dialogue across the arts and humanities through events like tonight's discussion. To learn more about the center and the events that we host, I invite you to join our mailing list, and I will post a link in the chat to where you can sign up for the mailing list. Tonight's event is a discussion between Susan Koff and the dancer, educator, and choreographer, John-Mario Sevilla. But first, I want to invite you, the audience, to be part of our discussion this evening. Please submit your questions to our speakers at any time during the conversation using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Again, you can submit the question at any time. If you think of something and want to be sure you don't forget, just go right ahead, put that in the Q&A button, and then we will get to your questions at the end of the conversation. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Susan R. Koff, Clinical Professor of Dance Education at NYU. Susan has over 20 years of experience teaching dance education in higher education. She was the director of the Graduate Dance and Dance Education Program in the Department of the Arts and Humanities at Teachers College, Columbia University. And most recently, she completed 10 years as director of the Dance Education Program here at NYU. She was also notably a Fulbright scholar visiting the National School of Contemporary Dance in Copenhagen, and she has worked with many organizations in a variety of capacities, including the National Arts Education Consortium and the Education Department of the New York City Ballet, where she helped to design and evaluate several integrated school-based programs. Susan is the author of numerous articles, and her first book, Dance Education, A Redefinition, is the book we are celebrating tonight. It was published this year by Methuen Press. Before I hand over the proceedings over to Susan, I would like to acknowledge our co-sponsor for this evening's event, which is the Center for Ballet and the Arts here at NYU. We are grateful to them for joining us in hosting this event. And now, without further ado, I hand you over to Susan to get the evening's conversation started.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you, Kyla, who you don't see, both from the Center for the Humanities at NYU. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this event. And also, it really began because the Center for the Humanities actually helped with the publication of my book through a very nice grant when I was nearing the end of writing it. So that was really great. And thank you also to the Center for Ballet and the Arts, because that was really helpful too. You know, all these connections across NYU are really great. So I'm doing something a little academic here. I'm going to do a little bit of a PowerPoint to get this started. So, and I will start with how did the book come to be? And it really started from, I had a rather traditional story of an upbringing. I have two brothers. We did traditional things growing up, and as a very traditional household would have it, the two boys gravitated towards sports and I gravitated towards dance. So there you have it. No one amongst us had professional aspirations in any of those areas. And so there was no real familial or other pressure to succeed at all costs. I was also very fortunate that my start in dance was with creative movement, which I find is much more aligned with childhood development rather than emphasizing techniques at an early age. I moved on through many years of dancing, but decided to choose an undergraduate degree not in dance. However, dance called me back. So then I finished a BFA, followed by an MA degree, and then an EDD degree, all in dance and dance education. Through those degrees, I also really changed my focus. The first degree was focused on performance, my own performance. The next degree was focused on teaching, but I was really focused on teaching the aspiring and continuing professional artist. And then the last degree really shifted my focus once again to teaching everyone. Through this time, I was also really questioning the definitions of all these changing areas that I was focusing on, and why people assumed that when I chose teaching as a profession, I must be because I couldn't dance. Additionally, because I chose to teach, nobody could understand what is it to be a dance educator. And that led to this article called Toward a Definition of Dance Education, which I published actually 21 years ago. And it has been heavily read and cited all these years since then. So following all that involvement and all that discussion, I was approached by Methuen and asked to write this book, which was a really exciting event for me. As Molly said, it's called Dance Education, a Redefinition. And through that, I really examined what it is to be a holistic dance educator. And I came to the definition through the book that a holistic dance educator is about everybody having the right and capability to be a full-fledged dancer in their own space and their own time. So here is a bit of the blurb on the back of the book. Dance education redefines the nature of dance pedagogy today, setting it within a holistic and encompassing framework, and argues for an approach to dance education from a sociocultural and philosophical perspective. In the past, dance education is focused on the learning of dance, limited to Western-based societies, with little attention to how dance is learned and applied globally. This book seeks to reframe the way dance education is defined, approached, and taught by looking beyond the privileged Western dance forms to compare education from different cultures. And coming to the definition that dance education in a holistic life is exploring the interweaving of dance education in formal, non-formal, and informal settings. So then you're probably saying, what is this formal, non-formal, and informal settings? And this is really where the crux of the book starts to take place. I've spent many years in higher education, as you've heard from my bio. And through that, I've worked a lot with both national and international dance education organizations. And through that work, we've become very involved with UNESCO's work in education and the arts and culture in people's lives. UNESCO years ago defined the different fields of education, and this is meant not just for any specific discipline, but for all disciplines. So formal learning is concerned with curriculum offerings within education and training institutions. Non-formal learning is acquired in addition or alternatively to formal learning. And informal learning is learning that occurs in daily life, in family, in the workplace, in communities, and through interests and activities of all individuals. Understanding these definitions takes a huge part of the book because I go through a definition of each. I summarize a research project that I did with several international colleagues that come from many different countries. And through that research project, we really defined more clearly what are the appearances of these types of learning and how we come to understand them in our lives. One of the key elements that we discuss in the book is that through the emphasis of formal learning, a lot of times different settings, and I'll just say inadvertently, completely dismiss the informal learning in people's lives, which I've come to discover is so very important. So now I'll switch to my colleague and friend, John-Mario Sevilla. His personal story, which became a chapter in the book, really exemplifies for me dance as a holistic life. And so I invited him to write this chapter because after several academic chapters of definition and contextual information, I thought that he brought a very humanistic and personal side to that. I could call the subtitle of this presentation this evening, A Story of a Friendship, because we together have woven 35, I think it's 36 years now, of shared experiences through formal, non-formal, and informal education, revealing how these elements intertwine in our own lives and how our sense of holistic engagement in dance is something that infuses our roles as educators. From this vantage point, we are sharing these stories in order to exemplify dance at the center of how we envision a holistic life. I should just go back to how we met through all those settings. In 1985, we were both students at a summer-long dance workshop, concentrated dance workshop, a residential workshop that was given by the Jose Limon Foundation and Dance Company. And we engaged with dance intently and intensely on a daily basis. And through that, we not only became friends, but we learned how to dance and laugh together, which are such important elements. From that, we stayed in touch. And about 10 years afterwards, as I was directing the program that Molly mentioned in the introduction at Teachers College, I suggested to John-Mario that he enter the master's degree program there, which he did and successfully completed. So we had a very important interaction at the formal education of dance education. And after that, we remained friends and colleagues. We've consulted on projects with each other. We have danced and laughed together through all of them. We have traveled together, and we have really also spent a lot of time deepening our conversations, which is really important because those deepened conversations have allowed us to examine our pathways over the years, what it means to us, and how we come to conceptions that we hold today. So to introduce John-Mario more formally, he's currently NYU's Asia Pacific American Institute visiting scholar. He was formerly the director of the 92Y Harkness Dance Center, the Dance Education Laboratory, and New York City Ballet Education Program, where he conducted residencies in about 300 New York City pre-K through 12 schools. His choreographic work has appeared at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, La Mama, NYU Steinhardt, Movement Research at Judson Church, the 92Y Harkness Dance Center, Dance Theater Workshop, Columbia University, ABC No Rio, Lower East Side Tenement Museum, the Asia Society, and the Bronx Academy of Art and Dance. He has danced in the companies of Palaboulos, Allison Chase, Murray Lewis and Alwyn Nicolai, Anna Sokolow, Rebecca Sten, Lisa Joby, Janice Brenner, Aaron Dudley, Bill Crady, and with juggler Michael Motion, drag artist Sherry Vine, poet John Unterrecher, and Navajo sand painter healer Walking Thunder. And I'll close his bio or introduction with a comment that he has made in another text that he wrote, which was really important to me because it shows how he's come full circle in his exploration of hula and how he understands hula as a very holistic practice. And he wrote, as keepers and storytellers of Native Hawaiian cultural and environmental legacies, hula practitioners uphold a deep connection to the elements of nature that are woven thematically throughout their poetry, music, choreography, and conduct in life. Ke'au Nani, for example, observes and extols birds in the air, flowers on the earth, trees in the upland, and fish in the ocean, elements of wonder that compose our beautiful world. John-Mario Sevilla.
Aloha kako. Hello, everybody. Aloha, Susan. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And allow me to introduce myself as a student of hula. O John-Mario Arcilla Sevilla ko inoa. My name is John-Mario Sevilla. O Francis Fortunata Arcilla ko umakua hine. Francis Fortunata Arcilla is my mother. O Sisqua Belon Sevilla is my ko umakua kane. Sisqua Belon Sevilla is my father. Or Paku Kalo Ku'u One Hanau. Paku, the place of my birth. Maui Ku'umokupuni. Maui is my island. O Wailuku Ku'umoku. Wailuku is my district. O Haleakala o Pu'ukukui Ku'umaumauna. Haleakala and Pu'ukukui are my mountains. O Iau Ku'u Awava Ame Kahavai. Iau is my valley and river. O Kaehu Ku'ukai. Kaehu is my ocean. O Hokulani Hot, o Jun Ka'ililani Tanoi, Ko'umau Kumuhula. Hokulani Holt and Jun Ka'ililani Tanoi are my hula teachers. I wanted to mention, Susan, you forgot one other element of our informal dance education relationship. I danced at your wedding. Dick. And so I just want to show that circle has intersected with into our lives. And it's interesting that you mentioned circles and how you said that I've come full circle. Whereas I was just thinking, as you said, that I'm constantly trying to complete circles in my life. And that's sort of my quest as a holistic dance practitioner, is to figure out how circles contain and how circles include and how circles connect. And so I actually, speaking of circles, did prepare a little graph. But before I go to the graph, I guess I wanted to read, if the people out there, a little excerpt from the book, because I think it just will help me start our conversation as I am now. So here's my opening to the chapter, The Formation of a Dancer. Birth and Becoming, an informal dance education. It wasn't until I had a performance career that I had a formal dance education. I was in my mid-30s, and it was at Teachers College, Columbia University. Already a dancer by profession, this was the first time I had studied dance in an academic environment. Curiously, before and since Teachers College, I've had signifying experiences both in and out of studios and classrooms that have indelibly sustained and inspired a dance life. Whenever I'm asked when I started dancing, I say, when I was born. My dance education began on the island of Maui with my mom, Francis Fortunata Arcilla Sevilla, right after birth. Received the attention and ensured my survival and well-being during that critical stage of my developing self. What, if not through the actions of the body, was I viably sensing, tasting, feeling, hearing, seeing, thinking, and learning during those initial months? What did I, an infant, an emerging being, experience during those inklings of cognition? Was she informing me then, leading me on a pathway, a curriculum of her design? Born in Pepe'ekeo, Hawaii, Frances was also the daughter of immigrants from Cebu and Leyte, Philippines. Her dance with my infant self, soothing, rocking, and bouncing, including clapping rhymes and songs of her parents that connected me to her, to my family history, to my expanding world. She's with Kumuhula and composers of her generation, Auntie Emma Farden Sharp. I am certain that during those critical swaying moments of human development, she imparted the kinesthetic and emotional flow of the dance, such that hula has always felt innate and natural, like I was born to do it. In truth, I was born into it. These messages of motion, melody, and pulse, dances of my earliest being and knowing, initiated deep habits of mind and body that I still feel today, and connect me with her and the elusive, potent history of Hawaii. Through this transmission of kinesthetic sensations, motion was meaningful. You'll notice as I was reading that my connection was being unstable. Uh, but that's probably my mother speaking to me from the other world. So I did prepare a little slide to get a little academic, to show, to organize visually what I had tried to say in text in Susan's chapter. And I don't know if Susan, are you able to share that? Is it being shared?
It is shared right now.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So one of the things I guess I wanted to point out is the element that the dashes of the circle are intentional. That that despite those circles, and those spheres, um, my experiences have not been so formally constructive. They've been much more fluid, and so I wanted to invite people in the audience, if they have a curiosity about any of those items in those circles, to place them in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll have time to address them. But first I wanted to ask Susan if she had a question about these circles or any of the elements in these circles that you wanted me to talk about. I already spoke about my mother and how she was very impactful in me and continues to be. Should I share a picture of her?
Absolutely. Oh,
There's my mother in her eternal dress in front of the piano that I played since I was 5.
so that's a good place to start because music goes throughout all of these circles. Could you tell us something about music and how it connects you in all of these areas?
Sure. Well, my parents are immigrants. My father and my mother both were from the Philippines. My mother's parents are from the Philippines. My mom was born on the Big Island. And they were very purposeful in becoming assimilated. They definitely wanted to become Americans. In fact, my dad, his name is Asisclo Baylon, but he would say his name is AB, which stood for American Boy, because he wanted so much to be an American. And it's part of they used to tell us that they wanted us to be, one of the ways to become American or to become was through the arts. And what that meant to my parents was studying music. So everyone in my family, dad played the violin, my mom played the piano. My dad started an orchestra in the plantation camps of Pu'unene, composed of Filipino musicians. My parents insisted that I take piano lessons from the age of 5. All of my siblings play a musical instrument, and so it was definitely a part of our family life. My dad was a DJ. He had a radio program every morning at 5 o'clock, and he would spend Saturday nights planning his musical playlist. Um, and I knew that one of the ways I could curry favor with my dad or calm him down if he was in one of his upset moods was to play the piano, and a particular song I would play would soothe him and song. But anyways, is it definitely part of our family life. And when I went to school, of course, arts education in Hawaii at the time was primarily visual arts and music. So in middle school, I started playing the trumpet. Then in high school, I moved to the French horn. And then in the non-formal area, music was part of our church. I sang in a church choir, and of course, through all of my music experience, dance experiences, music played a large part. So in that, my education has been from the very beginning rather holistic. It wasn't dance, I didn't get dance in the formal educational setting until much later in life.
Great, thank you. There was a question in the Q&A, but also something that I wanted to bring up, because as I look through these circles and I see the ways we've interacted throughout all these three circles, I mentioned Teachers College in the formal area, and in the informal area, you know, through all the work that we did together, through creating the work and after the work was done, we always had the most informal expressions of joy together. And I really want to emphasize those because I think that's what's missing in formal education, that we ignore the learning that happens in that, in what we might even call the in-between time. And so that has been a crucial part of our friendship and our knowing each other, both in and out of dance. But moving now to the non-formal section, you mentioned Betty and Fritz. And for those who don't know, Betty is Betty Jones, was Betty Jones, recently deceased, and Fritz Luden, her husband. They are of the longstanding Jose Limon dance tradition. And your first exposure to Limon was through Betty and Fritz's studio in Hawaii. And then years later, when we were past the performing ages, shall we say, we used to meet up together at Betty and Fritz's classes when they would move through New York once or twice a year. And so that's a long-standing connection. Is there anything else you want to say about Betty and Fritz?
Well, two things. One is you mentioned the word joy. um, and I wanted to just reiterate how critical that sensation of in all of these circles, and how critical I think it is to a dance experience that we experience joy. And maybe if you're a Joseph Campbell person, you think call it bliss, or and with Betty and Fritz, you know, for what I experienced with them was the sense of joy that was a passion on a level that I had not experienced before. First of all, my experience with Betty and Fritz was an accident. I had just come back from the Philippines studying Philippine folk dance, in that circle of non-formal dance experiences. I have the words church and pamana. And while I was in the choir, I decided that we should learn how to dance. And I belong to a congregation of Ilocanos, and Ilocanos are the Filipinos who live in the northern part of the Philippines. They speak Ilocano. My dad spoke Ilocano. My mom's family is from the south. She speaks Visayan, and Ilocano and Visayan are two totally different languages. They don't converse with each other. My mom could understand my dad, but my dad could not understand my mother, or at least he said he couldn't. But those two, so they always spoke to each other in English. But my dad took us to a Ilocano speaking congregation, and we did the whole service in Ilocano, and I pretended that I understood everything, even though I didn't. But I understood the pageantry and I was in the choir. And while we were in the choir, the choral director decided that she wanted us to learn folk dance because it was more of a community building group as opposed to a serious choir. We just spent a lot of time after school together. So as part of our community, we decided to do folk dance, and through that folk dance, I continued through middle school to be a folk dancer. And then in college, I joined my sister's folk dance troupe called Pamana, which was led by Hannah Gomez Trinidad, who was a dancer with the famous Bayanihan dance troupe of the Philippines. And after studying with her for about a year or two, I got a chance to go to the Philippines and study under scholarship with the Bayanihan at the Philippines Women's University. And after that summer of training, I scheduled to teach all the dances that I'd learned at this new studio called the Jones Ludent Dance Studio. And I happened to show up early for my lesson, and I walked into this room, and in this room there were three dancers, two women and a man, and an older couple who were kind of directing them, and they were doing this thing that I'd never seen before. At the time I called it limping. They were limping across the stage. It's actually PKs across the stage. And they were just like going up and down, back and forth, across each other, breaking through each other and jumping and twirling. And I was just, I was dumbstruck by this thing that I was watching, and happened. So at the end of this, they must have noticed a slack jaw look watching, because they approached me and asked me if I wanted to study dance, and I said of course, or if I wanted to study if I knew what I was watching, and I said no. And they said, oh, it's concert dance. And I said, oh, okay. And they said, would you like to learn it? And I said, of course. And that's how I started concert dance, or modern dance, was with Betty and Fritz. And so the following Monday I showed up in class and I started learning the Humphrey Lamont tradition of modern dance. And that dance that I watched was called Doris Humphrey's Invention. It was choreographed in 1949, the same year that Jose choreographed the Moors Pavane. So with the same cast. Oh, actually, no, it's not, sorry. But Jose's piece, the Moors Pavane, went on to much acclaim and became a classic, and Doris Humphrey's trio is kind of forgotten. But it is an amazing trio, and that sort of kickstarted my concert dance phase of my life.
I think that's really important that you mentioned your concert dance phase of your life, because many times one of the elements of the book that I'm trying to sort of create a counter narrative for is that concert dance is not dance. It's not encompassing all dance. And in so many places in the Western world, when you do say the word dance, we immediately fall into the concept of concert dance, ignoring everything else. And so part of the purpose of the book, and part of what's coming out in your description of your holistic experience, is that concert dance is only an aspect of it and not the core of it. And I think that's a really critical part of the definition for me. The other aspect that you brought out in this discussion amongst these three circles that I found really fascinating and would like to dig into a little further is that you mentioned when your father took this moniker of American boy and wanting to assimilate, there was a lot of vestige of being an immigrant, and how perhaps that wasn't the strongest identity that somebody wanted at that time. And now that you've gone in different directions in your life, and you're more intently investigating the art and expression through hula, which really represents your upbringing, you're also becoming very knowledgeable in how colonialism has really affected how we deal with that and how we've dealt with it in the past. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and how it played in different parts of your growing up and becoming involved in dance.
Well, let's see. For one thing, I just realized what a powerful force that can be. Growing up, everyone here in New York knows me as John-Mario, but growing up as a kid in Hawaii, I only went by the name of John. So all of my schoolmates and friends from elementary, middle, and high school know me as John, because the Mario just sounded so non-American that I kind of suppressed it. And so that, that element and part of that desire to be American that I inherited definitely from my parents also made me want to leave Hawaii as a child. I was the weird kid who couldn't wait to go to the mainland and go to school and become, whatever it is that I was going to become. Um, and then dance wise, just the whole gender element of dance and how males back in the 60s and 70s when I grew up, it wasn't really cool for a man, a boy to dance. And I think that's more of a, I don't know, it's not a universal because hula is definitely a male art form. But growing up in Hawaii, we had accommodated a more Western perspective of dance where boys don't dance. And I think that's kind of the one, you know, uh, the odd thing is, interestingly, my parents didn't think of dance as an art form either. They had a kind of adopted it as from a Western framework of being entertainment or fun. Even though I just talked about joy being important, they thought dance was something you do as recreation, which is important, but they didn't see the holistic value of it. And I don't know if that's a more Western point of view or where, where that comes from. But I definitely feel that today, that my dancing being has evolved as a result. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but uh, definitely. I mean, just even uh, uh, the idea as a profession, kind of a um, for uh, an immigrant family, the idea of success is economic financial success. So my parents really were, and everyone in my family had desires that each of us would become a professional doctor or a lawyer. Funnily, all of my siblings and I ended up in sort of community service and social work. My brother's a social worker, and my sister's a teacher. My other sister's a nurse. My other sister's a community organizer. Um, Everyone didn't go into the profession of business, law, or medicine that my parents had intended.
It's really interesting. And one of the elements that I want to get at, I think I'll just go, if anybody wants to come back and see these slides, we can bring them back later. But how this all led to a definition that I came up with in this book. And it is that dance education is inherently a student-centered process that engages the student in a holistic and integrated mind and body process, allowing the student a full range of expressive capabilities in order to encounter and understand self, others, and the world around them. So I'm just going to stop sharing this for a little bit. I have a couple of provocative questions at the end, but I wanted to go back to the concept of what colonialism has brought to your life and how it's been reflected through your dance. I think you touched on it a little bit. And just as a side before I ask you that question, so just hold that thought, is that what I've recognized, and part of the reason for the book, is that I've recognized that colonialism has definitely colored the way I've come into the world of dance education and how I've had to shift my frame so many times. So in some ways, our friendship has been, not in some ways, in many ways, our friendship has been very important because we can talk about these things and come to realizations and make honest recognitions of each other and our past and our experience. And that's really important to me. So now I'd like to ask you again, what has colonialism done to your growing up and to your perceptions of dance and dance education and to those of the people around you?
Um, well, it's interesting because I mentioned growing up as a Filipino folk dancer, and and studying with the National Folk Dance Company of the Philippines. And that in and of itself is a whole colonial manifestation, because it was what, even though the Bayan Folk Dance Company is an amazing dance company with amazing dancers, a lot of that practice has been, taking indigenous dance forms and then repurposing them or presenting them for a theatrical purpose. So some of the I grew up with learning the whole canon of Philippine folk dance from, the colonial dancers that were reiterating Spanish or continental European folk dance forms like the mazurkas and the fandangos and the waltzes and the jotas. Filipinos took those forms, made them their own, which is a kind of different kind of cross-colonial interaction or reciprocity, I guess. But then trying to create a national dance company, the company in Manila decided to go to the different tribes all over the country, because there are, indigenous tribes of the north, there are the Muslim tribes in the south, and in all of the barrios, there are all the different folk dances that the particular barrios perform for whatever occasion. And they would take those dance forms and then re-choreograph them for the stage. And that became the canon of Philippine folk dance. But we all know today that's more folkloric, and that's just bringing indigenous dance forms to a theatrical proscenium environment, which is primarily a more Western perspective of dance or experience of dance. And audience members. So that's that colonial experience in terms of my Filipino folk dance experience. And then in Hawaii, the encounter with missionaries had a huge impact on Hawaii, and it coincided with just the whole transition of a native population with its strong social, cultural, political institutions that gets transformed, most likely because of the dire death of the 71% of the population due to introduced illnesses. So the whole infrastructure, social, cultural, political infrastructure of Hawaii gets damaged. What places it is a Western perspective of religion and finance and commerce and economy, but also perspectives of the body. So the people who missionary evangelists who came and greatly influenced Hawaiians came with this perspective of the body being the dance of the Hawaiians, first of all, was sinful and lascivious, I think were the words they used. And so they actually banned hula for years, or made it penalized people or restricted its public performance through much of the 19th century. And then luckily there are some practitioners who held on to the tradition, and King David Kalakaua, who was the second to the last monarch of Hawaii, decided to bring back a nation state to circumnavigate the globe. Noticed that every country had its national dance, and of course Hawaii had a national dance that was hula, so he revived hula, much to the disdain of the converted Christians and the missionaries, and luckily that hula survives. Then his sister comes to power, and she gets overthrown by business interests who want to maintain ties with the United States. And it's during that time where a couple things happen. Hawaiian language is banned. People are not allowed to speak Hawaiian, and there's a huge shift for away from traditional native practitioners. There's an influx of immigrants, my family being among them, and towards American, it's a social, political, economic wave that happens. and the cultural practices of Hawaiians, Native Hawaiians, become looked down upon and almost close to erasure, and including hula. But luckily, there are people who are continuing the traditions privately and not in public view. So that was been one of the major impacts of colonialization on hula, a near extinction of an art form. Um, and you know, but luckily the body of the traditional embodiments of
So the way you describe that, and I talked about my own background growing up in a very traditional Western, lovely family home, not anything against it. But at the same time, we lived in Tucson, Arizona, which is in the center of a huge amount of indigenous population in the United States. And much of your story about the hula practices in Hawaii sort of mimic the practices of Native American dance close to where I grew up and throughout the United States and many other parts of the world. And that it was sort of put aside for a while. And then now it's brought forward as more of a performative entertainment event. And one of the things that, years later, as I call myself a dance educator, that I lament is that I never engaged with that in any serious way in my growing up years, though I lived so adjacent to it. And part of it, I don't fault anybody. My dance practice was, not excluding it consciously. It's just the way life was structured where I grew up. And it was an unfortunate, huge missed experience because I didn't have roots in that part of the country, into those populations, that I couldn't experience it in the way that one could experience it. Fast forward many years later, and another part of the practice that I bring out in the book is that when we encounter students in our own practice and all the different ways, you've been a dance educator and I've been a dance educator, and someone comes into a school with one of those practices that you've talked about or that I mentioned in the Native American practices, or any other practices that exist around the world, that people developed from informal education and they learned from informal education. When they get into the formal schooling and maybe are of the good fortune to have a dance teacher in that setting, my own research has shown that oftentimes the dance educator will dismiss that beautiful knowledge that a student will bring into class and dismiss it as not dancing and denigrate it even, and just say dancing is following these lines and these practices of Western codified dance forms that end up usually on the concert stage. And so what I love about your personal story is that you were able to somehow integrate all of those practices without having it being denigrated, and that you can celebrate it in your life. And what I hope for through this book and through my own educational practice is that I'll be able to encourage people to come into the public and formal education sphere with a much more embracing practice that doesn't work so top down and say, this is what we're learning, but rather we're going to learn from each other. And that's what I call dance education as a holistic life experience, so that we learn from each other and we bring all those practices. And even the practices that you spoke of with your father, with his radio show, I'm sure there was dancing around the living room as he was talking about music, playing music and things like that. And those are all the elements in people's lives that too often we dismiss, that are so integral to who we are as people. I want to celebrate that practice and allow all that living room dancing, so to speak, or bedroom dancing to be what we really can enjoy about ourselves and each other.
I actually think that's a kind of critical part of my growth, my experience in dance has been the social element, the familial element, the parties, the celebrations. My family loved to dance, and at every party, my aunts and uncles and my mom and dad loved to jitterbug. And I grew up with weekends watching them jitterbug. And I don't know exactly how it got to Hawaii, but my um, I think came with during World War II. It must have come with the military. Um, they were kind of critical, and if you growing up in a Filipino community, you experience all the Filipino rituals that happen during a wedding. And I was just explaining to my students this couple weeks ago about, wedding celebrations and all the ways that people dance at weddings. The bride and groom have to dance, and the groom and the mom, and then the pairings have to happen. And from that very early age, I was fascinated by that. And even though it happened every week, I just found it really compelling. And you know, it was lucky me having to grow up in Hawaii, where I got to observe all different cultures celebrating in different ways.
That is really critical. And that's so important. And that's
It's really
exactly.
critical, and it's not in the classroom. It's out in life. It's out in the churches. It's out in the temples. We have this thing in Hawaii, in Japan, from Japan, the Obon Festival in June, where they celebrate. It's for the departed, and it's a huge festival with drums and everyone circle dances, and that was my dance education. We did not. I did have dance in elementary school. We had this thing called May Day, and it was pretty much every student, every class, every grade had to prepare a dance. And so every year, once a year, we performed. So I performed a hula in my element and kindergarten, the maypole. We did every possible the scarf dance here and there. And to me, they had a different kind of curriculum. It was learning the steps but learning a little bit about the culture, but just seeing it all in one open field with everyone dancing was kind of so impactful for me. But just, you know, it's so interesting. I mean, I guess now and television was an important teacher to me as well. I spent weekends watching American Bandstand and Soul Train, and I guess now you have TikTok. But all these elements are to me valid expressions of movement.
I agree. They're all valid expressions of movement. But even as you described your elementary school years, they were put on the periphery of the fundamental education. And I think the place we're both working for, dance, as a holistic life, is putting it at the core and not,
In
exiting.
life and school.
Yes, in life and school, absolutely. And that's
Yeah.
where we're both coming from. And I would just, say, just to emphasize it from a little sort of, to go into my wonky self and educational theory, which we've talked about a lot. Also, there are, two theories of being an educator. One is that you look at a student as being a blank slate, an empty vessel or something like that, and you fill that vessel with knowledge. And the other theory is that the student is a vibrant, interesting person, and instead you let that person open up to you, and then you help guide that person in further explorations and more like guided discovery. And our vision for dance education is to take that second image, because if we take the first image where a student is a blank slate or an empty vessel, then we say there's nothing there, and then all those rich experiences that you've spoken about that come from your early years, from your mother's womb, from your experiences in life and, home and family. It's as if they don't exist. And we have to allow those to not only come into the classroom, but to really be valued and to allow people to express themselves fully so that they can continue to learn how to express themselves. And that's where, our vision, I know together, is where we want people to go with that. So at this point, I'm looking at the clock, and I think it's time to open this up for anything that the audience might want to share. I do see one question from Julie Malnick. Hi, Julie. That she wants you to go back to your circles and talk about, I think you did start to talk about it, but you had television parties listed.
Oh, television and parties, they're two separate things. When I had to stop dancing at age 5 because I had an older brother who didn't like the idea of having a younger brother dancing around the living room or my dad's store, which was what I was doing. I was having my own shows. So I stopped dancing, and the only place that I could find an outlet for dance was dad's bedroom closet where my sister's costumes were, where I would do a healthy bit of dress up when nobody was looking. And on Saturdays, they had those TV shows, American Bandstand, Soul Train. They also had movies. I saw every filmed version of a musical there was on the island of Maui. And that was the only thing that I had for my dance experience, my education. So that's what I consider my informal dance education through media, to television. Then in terms of celebrations, like I mentioned, parties were so important to the community, both my family as well as the larger Filipino community of Maui. My parents were pretty active. My dad was a radio announcer and several businesses. And my mom, though she wasn't a lawyer, she could have been an immigration lawyer because she knew all of the regulations and helped to bring family members of Filipino immigrants from the Philippines to Hawaii. So they were at the center of a growing Filipino community. So that meant every Saturday we would go to a wedding. And at these weddings, there was always a band, there was always dancing, there was always jitterbugging, there was just a whirlwind of movement around us. And I just first of all, it was a celebration, so it was immensely joyous. That was an education to me, to watch people dance together and to express joy, to honor events. Informal dance education, going to parties and watching TV.
That is so important. And the part about your story that I both love and is also very sad, I love the fact that you found ways to dance regardless of the limitations put on you. But the sad part is your mention of limitations of sensations from other people that what you're doing may or may not be appropriate. And I think that's another critical piece that we have to take into account. Dancing is a really important part. It's always an important part of my life, as we could tell, and probably for everybody who's here. And it's because it's where we find our holistic self, that it's a way to express something we can't normally express another way. I love the especially during the pandemic, I took a lot of serious walks around a park close to me, and there was always this group sitting with oldies playing, and I would just, cut a rug, so to speak. And we became friends, not through words, but just through sort of swaying around in the park together, an impromptu event. And I think these are really critical parts to our lives that we should celebrate of people, and we really shouldn't deny them. So let's see, I see some other comments in the questions. This is a long one, so I'm going to read it. Okay. Social dance is often perceived as frivolous, especially in academic and professional environments. Yes, I agree. But it also can be a vital component in community development and social cohesion. I also agree. Okay, as a person wanting to pursue an advanced degree to study social dance, well-being, and community development, oh boy, what advice would you have to someone who wants to explore these ideas, but it has been told repeatedly that it's not academic enough? There's the crux of the problem. Or that most programs focus on an embodied practice and choreography, that there is no value in social dance. I think that's a really critical comment. Yes. And I'm glad I read that.
Have you tried, Susan, that person should apply to your program. So when is dance not social?
Right. When is dance not social? That's a very good question. But dance is always social, even when you're doing it by yourself, as you said, grabbing costumes in the closet. There's something social about it because you're expressing, as soon as you start to express who you are, you're being social. And you're embodying yourself.
And when does, I have a question. What is a non-social dance form? I guess a professional dance form. I guess theatrical, that's so anonymous attendee is stating a thing that we encounter a lot where we privilege professionalism, we privilege like proscenium theater as a form of dance. We privilege a certain kind of technique, perhaps. Um, and we all know that social dance has technique. And some social dances have techniques that I could never acquire. That's an interesting question.
That's an interesting question, and I think that question comes to the crux of the problem, that no matter how far we go as we think of ourselves as enlightened people and educated people, there still is a very traditionalist, old-fashioned perspective. To study dance, you must be a Western-based choreographer who has aspirations for the concert stage. And I think that's a misnomer. And I'll just say to that person, if you reach out to me, after this session, I could have a more serious discussion with you. But I think asking that question is really critical, because I think people have actually been shut down because they can't go the direction they really want to go. And I'll just extend it a little. I had a conversation the other day with somebody who has a little bit of a dance background, but is really interested in environmental education and in conscious use of the community and the planet and our natural resources. And I just looked at her and I said, what you're talking about can be a dance project. It can be, and it should be, because you have this avenue of expression and you both want to make people aware of the environment and also educate them about ways that they can deal with the environment in more healthful ways. Then you have the communication capabilities with dance as your vehicle for communication. So dance is there within us, and we need to be able to learn how to connect it to everything that we care about and that we feel and that we practice.
And I also want to say, I mentioned the jitterbug because my parents love to dance the jitterbug, my aunts and uncles, and how I was fascinated by that. If you really look, for example, social dance form and where the roots of that, and you really trace it back towards, where that dance form comes from, the Lindy Hop and the social dance forms that come from a history, and you trace that history back towards, the Great Migration of African Americans, and you trace even further back, and you go even further back in history, you actually see an immensely rich and deep discipline of study. And I think if you take any dance form, today I look at things that are being generated on TikTok or like Instagram, and and while they may seem frivolous or fun, you can begin to imagine the larger circles or contexts of history that
Mhm.
are converging on these very
Mhm.
just for the moment, but really are speaking from the past. And so, things like social dance, and the context of a social dance. There's so many interesting things one could explore, um, and I, and the fact that certain dance forms, depending on the culture you're from, they what's social and what's professional, they're not as siloed as they are in our Western perspective.
Mm.
You know, and anyway,
That's
uh,
critical. That's critical what you just said now. And I think what we're starting to realize in westernized countries as we become more globally aware that making this separation on our lives, making these silos, as you called them, of saying, this is my academic life, or this is my dance life, or this is my family life, um, really takes away some of the richness and what the actual richness that we're going for in dance as a holistic life. Within families, we're all dancing together. Within, friends groups, we're all dancing together in and out of, our jobs, our educations, what we're doing. We're always dancing. We're dancing our way through things. And when we start to value that aspect of our own expression, then we've really achieved what I, keep emphasizing as a holistic life. So I'll just turn to another question. Hello, Diane Duggan, who we both know. She says, so wonderful to hear about your dance journey, John-Mario. You mentioned how participating in church services influenced your conception and practice of dance. Can you speak more about that?
well, I always considered the ritual at church to be a dance, and I don't know where I began to imagine that, but maybe it was the costumes, maybe it was the form gestures that we all had to do, the standing, the sitting, the kneeling, that we all had to perform as a group in unison. Uh, then there was the choir and the fact that my church choir had to dance. And it wasn't liturgical dance, but it was a kind of folk dance that was part of the church experience, even though they weren't the same. Um, so I thought of church as a dance experience, both as a ritual, um, a gather a community, and to express some thoughts and values about meaning in the world, and how we treat one another, perhaps. But then I also saw it as an avenue, as extra church activities that just met that was organized on behalf of the children of the RU community, that allowed us to sing and dance and outside of the service. So both the ritual, the service, as well as the activities surrounding the church community was how it impacted me in a non-formal way.
Thank you. I think we have time for two more questions in the chat. So yes, we can do this. Someone asked, did you mention a prejudice towards your community and the development of your folk dancing adaptations by the Hawaiian community as a whole?
When I'm not sure, but adaptations by the Hawaiian community. Well, I think that questions did towards community and develop um, prejudice towards your community by the Hawaiian community as a whole.
So I think maybe the Filipino community from the Hawaiian
Um,
community.
I wouldn't say there's any prejudice towards the Filipino folk community and the hula community, or vice versa. Um, I think in Hawaii, there's actually general respect among might think that there's been a little bit of this merging in some elements. So one of the ways that colonialism has impacted hula, you'll see, is that the sort of commercial or hula for tourists, which is called hula awana. It's actually a very valued and respected form of hula in Hawaii, but it's sort of an evolution of the traditional form that introduced Western musical instruments, as well as English. So there are English words in the hula, and the gestures become more, what do you call, mimetic. But it's a legitimate form of hula. But that's one way that it has used that kind of hula. People used to think that wasn't as legitimate as the ancient traditional hula, but it's become acceptable and valued and respected. But I think, some people think that now there's a form of hula where you have men and women dance together, because typically the women dance separately from men, but then every once in a while they'll have where the men and women are partnered, which isn't which is not very frequent. And a friend of mine seems to think that's an influence. I don't know if that's of the Filipino folk tradition on hula. But I don't know if that's true, but I've heard that. Or people who do it well come from a Filipino folk tradition.
Okay, so the last question I'll entertain is actually from somebody with the same last name as mine. And she asks,
Oh, hi, Nancy.
yes, she asks if we could both talk about our roles in helping all the participants in a learning setting, not only draw upon their own informal and non-formal experiences, but also communicate the richness of these experiences to each other. Would you like to start with that? It's a heavy question.
Yeah, to get people to reflect. I would imagine everyone has a mother, or has a family member, that has been impactful on your lives. People who to different areas that they have dance experience that are particularly meaningful. I think. So that's how. Okay, here's what I think I did. Okay, sorry, I misunderstood the question. So here's one of the things that I always try to do is I always try to plan parties, or to try and have the social elements of a programming dance be front and be among, at least up front, so for example, I think it's events, and I thought all of events should have a social element to it, and not particularly curricular in a sense of content. So I think if that makes any sense, so that the environment of learning is a hybrid of both. It might be in a classroom, but that the setting, the communication, the vibe of the room has a social, interpersonal, collective, so that the class develops as a culture of its own. So that's how I set up in my own practice as a teacher. I try to think about how people are relating to each other in a sense. So collaborating with each other is important. Developing processes of reciprocity so that everybody gets to engage. Setting up opportunities for all different kinds of people in the room to engage so that they can feel welcome and participate in the process from their own strength. And then having people talk about their and acknowledge their history and family and you know, I ask students to bring their elders with them to the classroom, so that we can acknowledge that everyone comes from a different culture and comes from a different background. So those are a few of the ways that I, in a classroom setting, create a more holistic picture of circles
Right.
merging.
That's a really great image. I'll offer a little more going into academic theory, but it also points to a different chapter in the book in which I engage in a practice with another former student who's become a close friend. His name is Alf Daniels Mabingo, and he comes from Uganda and came to NYU to study for his master's degree. And in having him as a student, what I had to learn to do, not even just with him, but with any student who comes from a very different background of my own, is to really engage with another person and understand their own background. And so then Mabingo and I years later wrote this chapter for the book because we talked about this process from the theoretical perspective as not being ethnocentric, but being ethno-relative. And so ethno-relativity is ethnocentricity, to go back to the theory, is putting yourself at the center and having everybody just learn from you and revolve around you. Unfortunately, we know a lot of politicians who do that, but to stay in the dance classroom, if you're ethno-relative, then the first thing you do is engage with knowing how your own practice is similar or different than the practices and the experiences of others. And in doing that, then we can really start to bring everybody's practices into the room and not shut them outside. So that would be my answer to that question. And at that point, I think we're actually at the end of the questions. So I just want to have a couple of thank yous in closing. First of all, to John-Mario, the greatest appreciation of all for just being an amazing friend for so long and for all the experiences that we've yet to engage with together, dancing around music studios and definitely good food that we do so well together. To the Center for the Humanities, Molly, Kayla, and to the Center for Ballet and the Arts, for all of you for supporting this kind of work and for making a forum to have conversations like these. And the last word I really want to say, somebody whose work that John-Mario and I both know so well, and somebody I quote quite frequently in my book, is Maxine Green. She was an educational philosopher who worked for many years engaging with arts education on many different levels. And the comment that she always made was, there is always more. So as this conversation is gone, as the world of dance as a holistic life goes, I just want to say there is always more. And I look forward to engaging more in these conversations. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you, John-Mario, for both joining us. I do also want to again acknowledge the Center for Ballet and the Arts and thank my colleagues Kyla Bowen and Denny Valentine, who are super helpful in ways that you all don't know, but is absolutely vital to our running these events. And finally, I would like to acknowledge something that I should have said before, which is that Susan's book, Dance Education, A Redefinition, is the 2021 Ruth Lavelle Murray Award winner given out by the National Dance Education Organization. So we should acknowledge that this is an award-winning book, and I hope you all run out and get a copy now, because it will change your understanding of what it's like to move through the world. So thank you both so much for joining us.